How many of you read the Dietz et al., the Dietz paper, 2003? I see 10 hands. Is that like all we got here? Broken arms? Who's got broken arms? Everybody raise your hand. All your hands up. All the hands up. All the hands up. This is not war. There we go. In the house. Okay. Now, put your hands down. Now I know your hands work. Who read Dietz and the Ostrom and so on? Okay. Who read the Coase paper? Who made it to the end without dying? It was terrible. My God, that guy needs an editor. It was like 20 pages too long. So I'm sorry about that. I read it a couple years ago. I was told to read it by my professor. I forgot how painful it was. But we'll talk about Coase. And I think, he's writing, he's number one, he's a lawyer. And he got a Nobel Prize in economics, but he's a lawyer. But he was also writing in the 1960s when people had plenty of time to read things. They didn't have Twitter and stuff. So in that sense, please go that way. In that sense, he was writing in a contemporary style, and maybe you got. I got fed up with the railroad cars and the cake factory. It's like, just give me one example. Don't give me 12 examples about so and so. Anyway, I will summarize that paper for you briefly. The point that Coase makes is very important. And he took 50 pages to make it. That's fine. The other paper is much more concise, not just because it was contemporary, but also because it was published in, what is this? Science, which is a nice journal that keeps things clean. I'm just so curious because, I looked at how many people handed in homework last time, and then I look at the number of people who are here. And I've realized that some people come in, hand in the homework, and leave again, which is really, I just saw a girl do that. She just left. And so she hadn't picked up her homework. I don't think that matters necessarily. Some people learn in different ways. But as I said, I'm very curious to see how this turns out, attending versus watching the lectures or just doing the homeworks and not doing anything at all. But we'll find out. I like studying students as much as you guys like studying economics. So today we're going to talk about markets and market failure, governments and government failure, and then we'll get into regulation and taxes and so on. Lots of last minute. Please come on time. You guys, next time. Do you come every session or just occasionally? Every section, then come on time. If you come occasionally, I don't care. And somebody who sent me an email said I might not make it on time. Are you in the audience right now? Okay, if you send me an email because you don't come here, I'm taking a point off automatically. So bring it in person. All right, so what is a market failure? You, what's a market failure? Yes. If you come late, I get to ask you questions. So what's a market failure? That's okay, you can answer. Imperfect market? Almost. What competition? Perfect competition. No, those are key words, but that's not exactly what I'm asking about. Who knows what a market failure is? You with the hand gel. What's a market failure? Sorry? Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. No. That's efficiency in a marketplace. Almost. When welfare is not maximized. There's Mr. Eager. What is it? Say that again? Moral hazard. Not exactly. That could be there. You guys, you hit each other later. What is it? Not exactly. A market failure, so you guys are saying some things are very, they're correct but not at all what I'm asking about. Some things are problems with markets, right? Not reaching total efficiency. But a market failure usually means that consumers and firms in the market are conducting activities that has negative impacts that they're not internalizing, right? Market failures are when you have negative externalities, right? So we've been talking about negative externalities. We've talked about Pigouvian taxes and so on. But the reason that those are offered up is people say, oh, there's a market failure. There is not, for example, enough education in Canada, so we will subsidize education to have more education. There is not, people do not buy health insurance, so we will require they buy health insurance, or we will subsidize their purchase of health insurance. People are driving cars around, and cars create pollution, so we will tax either cars or gasoline. Those are all market failures, and market failures are generally used as a reason for a government intervention in the market. The government will intervene to correct the market failure. There is too much driving going on, and so the government is going to put a cap on the total number of cars, or they're going to tax gasoline. Those are market failures. On the other hand, you could have a government failure. What's a government failure? Maybe you haven't heard about this, but use your imagination. What do you think about when the government fails?
When the government puts in a policy that creates a negative externality towards the people?
Yes, let's go with that. The government puts in a policy that creates a negative externality. This is the correct thing I was thinking of. Just think government failure, market failure. There must be something similar, right? The similarity is that there's a negative externality. But the government is enforcing a rule that is causing more harm than good. Okay? Now, I'll give you an example of this. One of my favorite examples, because it's such a disastrous example, is the U.S. ethanol policy. Ethanol is a fuel that's made out of usually some kind of crop. In the U.S., it's made out of corn, maize. When it came around to discussing climate change and so on, the people said, wow, we are burning too much fossil fuels, too much gasoline. We should burn more renewable fuels, or biofuels, they called it. And so ethanol was going to be a substitute for gas. And it was going to do two things. It was going to reduce CO2 emissions, and it was going to that was basically the only thing it was supposed to do. The other part of what it was supposed to do is make America great by using American corn, USA corn, instead of that nasty Saudi oil or Nigerian oil or whatever, right? So we were going to have our own source of fuel, energy independence, and so on, ignoring the very kind Canadian neighbors just to the north who had tar sands, who could offer all kinds of fuel. No, we want to grow our own fuel in the source of corn, in the form of corn. And the government said, but the marketplace is failing. People are buying gasoline to use in their cars. Well, we want them to use ethanol. So we're going to require as a law that 10% of gasoline sold is ethanol. 10%, and they put a little American flag next to the pump and said, you're pumping American fuel, 10% corn ethanol. And why did they need to require that ethanol be used in fuel? If ethanol is cleaner than gasoline, why do they need to require that ethanol be used in fuel? Because it's more expensive, right? If I require that you buy, a Starbucks coffee instead of getting a Tim Hortons coffee, Starbucks is very happy to see the new business. You're not necessarily better off, right? You were going to Tim Hortons in the first place. You're just getting a cup of brew coffee, right? Nothing fancy with sprinkles and lattes and stuff, right? Just a regular coffee. So if the government is requiring that you do it to correct a market failure, then, okay, you're doing it, but the biggest question is the government actually correcting the failure or making a bigger failure? Now, in some cases, for example, in California in the 1970s, where they had big problems with air pollution and people were getting asthma, and older people were dying, and so on, California said, we're going to adopt clean air regulations. Number one, we're going to take the lead out of fuel, right? Unleaded fuel is very normal for almost all of you. When I grew up, there was lead in the fuel. So there's lead in the air. Lead will make your brain not work. So I used to be smarter, right? It's just terrible. I was like genius and everything. So you get lead in the fuel, and they also wanted to reduce the emissions, so they required catalytic converters in the car, right? That's in part of the old exhaust system would be burn and out, right? It's like a straight pipe. Anybody who's a hot rodder, you know you want to have a straight pipe. But California required catalytic converters, and those were government interventions that did not create bigger problems. That was a good regulation in the sense that the price of fuel went up by a bit because unleaded fuel costs more. The cars had to be changed. All of their engines and gears and so on had to be changed to deal with no lead because lead was in the fuel to lubricate the engine. And the catalytic converters cost money because they have platinum in them. Platinum's very expensive, et cetera. It's more stuff to put in. But people in California had better quality air to breathe, right? Message to people in China, right? So, and someone in my 482 class is doing a presentation about oil refineries in China. Interesting, he says that the oil refineries are using old technology, so the fuel is not so clean, right? I don't know if is it unleaded fuel in China or leaded fuel? Do you know? Unleaded? Okay, so it's unleaded fuel, which is a good step, right? And then it'll have to be higher octane fuel, so it burns more clean. Whatever. I'm not a fuel engineer. The point is they did this in California. It was a good idea. Ethanol, not a good idea. What happened is you've got corn. You're growing corn, and you see a rise in pesticides, herbicides, fertilizer. Corn is a very intense crop. It's a very needy crop. It needs fertilizer. It doesn't want to grow on its own. You need to dump a whole bunch of artificial fertilizer on it. Fertilizer, just so you know, guess what, is made out of natural gas. And these things all go into water. And when you take corn from the ground, from the land, you have America is big, but if you start growing more and more and more corn, you have less space for other crops, right? So less food, basically, right? The U.S. right now, I believe, puts something like 1/3 or 1/2 of its corn crop into ethanol, which means that there is not corn, on the one hand, for feeding animals, which is how Americans grow beef or make beef and pigs and so on, but also America is not exporting corn anymore. The U.S. is not exporting corn. What does that do to the price of corn around the world? It goes up, right? Because supply is falling, right? So now we've got food prices up. In 2007, 2008, was anybody paying attention to this thing called the food crisis? Right? There were some riots in some countries. Different countries didn't have rice. Some countries who are exporting rice stopped exporting rice from Thailand and so on because they needed it for their food security because they didn't want to have the government fall down. All of that problem was part of the corn policy of the United States. So you've got food prices up, natural gas consumption up, water quality down. Water quality is falling because pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizer go in the river, and they kill the fish, first of all. Secondly, when the river goes down into the Mississippi or anywhere else it goes, it creates what's called a dead zone. A dead zone is because there's so much fertilizer in the water that a whole bunch of algae bloom. They use up all the oxygen in the water, and then anything that needs oxygen, like fish, die. So you have a dead zone that is the size of it's several thousand square kilometers of dead zone. This has happened in other countries that have deltas. It's happened off the coast of China, I know. It's happened in the Mediterranean, I know. It's happened off of India a little bit. But dead zones are not good for fishermen. So now you're going to lose, you've got water quality going down, you've got fish going down, let alone all the other things that go around fish. More fish are killed in the dead zone than were killed by that huge oil spill that BP did in the Gulf of Mexico, right? Every year they're killed in the dead zone because every year the cornfields spew that water out. Okay, so now we've got pesticides, natural gas consumption goes up, water quality falls, the number of fish fall, the food price goes up. Wow, it wasn't exactly very good as far as this is concerned. Even worse, it turns out that ethanol does not actually lower CO2 emissions when you look at the life cycle of ethanol, right? Ethanol requires corn. You have to grow corn. Growing corn takes energy. You use a diesel tractor. You're using natural gas in the fertilizer. You've got to haul it to the plant to be processed into ethanol. Then you've got to bring it, just like any other fuel, to the gas station. So it was actually not clear if ethanol is reducing CO2. It's plus or minus 100% of the CO2 output of gasoline. It's basically the same. I should actually say more or less equal, not 100%. It's more or less equal, right, to gasoline in terms of carbon. So now you're not even doing the earth a favor. Now, the best part about this whole ethanol story is that after all of this information came out in the last 10 or 15 years about how bad ethanol is for the environment and for food prices and for other food crop productions and so on, the U.S. government hasn't stopped it. The policy is still in place. We're still destroying the fish in the Gulf and so on. Why is that? If it's such a terrible policy, why is it still in place? Why is it still in place? Didn't find something else to replace ethanol? Good, but no, because we have gasoline. Ethanol replaced gasoline. Why is the government still requiring? What? Sorry? It's not? No, that's what I just said here, is that the ethanol produces the same pollution as gasoline. Right? They thought it would be less. But it's the same pollution as gasoline. Why is it still happening, this ethanol policy? I'll go with that. That's correct. Okay? If the politicians put it in place, the politicians can take it out of place. But not just the politicians. Who benefits from the corn ethanol program? Corn companies. And let's get into the supply chain. The companies that supply corn seed, the farmers that grow corn, the companies that process corn into ethanol, right? Which are very large, literally mega corporation, right? Archer, Daniels, Midland, Cargill, these are the biggest commodity traders in the world. And they are very happy with this program because now they have doubled their volume of trading corn. Of course, who's unhappy? BP, Exxon, Chevron, right? Now, they're unhappy, but it's a law, and you deal with it. Oil companies have been kicked around for years. So this example is an example of government failure because the government, had it done nothing at all, it would have been better, right? So they came in to try and fix something, and it turned out it was a bad idea. Now, here's an interesting point that I want you to take from this as a generalization of how governance failures. So we know market failures are based on two people being very happy working together and some third party gets screwed, right? In Los Angeles in the 1970s, people would drive their cars. They would be happy. The gas stations would sell their cars. And children like me would be breathing terrible air and die. Okay, so that's a market failure. But a government failure is also harming the population. And it can be perpetuated. It can't be ended by market intervention. So a market failure can be ended by a government intervention. But a government failure cannot be ended by a market intervention because the government controls the market. The government is bigger than the market. So what we have here is a thing called Baptists. The reason it persists is is a coalition called Baptists and Bootleggers. I'll explain this. This is a very significant idea, and it uses this little cartoon, these words. Baptists are a type of religious community. They're Christians, and they believe that you shouldn't drink alcohol at all because, whatever, it's bad. Bootleggers are guys who sell alcohol from their boot. Right? That idea, the word comes from the United States in the 1920s. Remember Al Capone and the gangsters and the mob and all this stuff, violence in Chicago, Prohibition. The whole idea of the mafia came from Prohibition in the United States, where the government said it's illegal to sell alcohol for 10 years or so. And a whole bunch of people like drinking alcohol. So the government said, we're going to stop that alcohol drinking. So they called alcohol a market failure. People are drinking alcohol, it's bad. So we're going to stop the market failure by having a government intervention. And what it did is it said, hey, you want to drink beer? You want to drink whiskey? I'll sell it to you, just don't tell the government. Oh, by the way, the price is double. Right? It's like BC Liquor, right? If you want to drink, you got to go to BC Liquor, you pay their price. In the US, actually, that's what happens right now. Are you guys allowed to? You can all drink, right? Because it's 18 or something. The U.S. is stupid, the 21 years drinking age. But everybody drinks anyway, right? So the thing is that the price of beer and wine in BC is high because the government has a monopoly on the distribution of alcohol, and they set prices that are minimum prices. And if you like drinking, like I do, then you go to U-Brew or whatever it is, or Homebrew, and you make your own beer, your own wine. That's what happened in the U.S. in a huge way during Prohibition, because there was no BC Liquor at all even. You couldn't buy booze legally. You went to a speakeasy, right? Or you paid you bought you bought alcohol from the bootlegger, the guy who was smuggling alcohol. And those guys are going to, and Canadians, by the way, smuggled a huge amount of alcohol into the United States. It was such a huge win for Canadian alcohol producers. So they're going to smuggle the alcohol in, the Crown Royale or whatever. They buy it for $10 a liter. They take it over to the U.S. They sell it for $50 a liter. Why? Because there's police coming after them. They have to hide. They have the risk of going to jail. Oh, and by the way, the other guy who's trying to sell Crown Royale wants to kill you because it's his territory. Right? So gang warfare originated around Prohibition. These guys, bootleggers, are not nice people. But they do have alcohol, so you do want to meet them, right? So it's kind of a strange thing. Here's where this story leads. The Baptists in some towns in the U.S., they made a law saying you can't sell alcohol on a Sunday. So this is not Prohibition anymore. This is just regular today. Today it's still true in some parts of the U.S. You cannot buy alcohol. They said you can't buy alcohol on a Sunday because it's God's day and we don't want you getting drunk. BC Liquor is shut on Sunday, by the way, right? Notice that BC Liquor also doesn't want you to buy alcohol on Sunday. But what do you do if BC Liquor is shut? You go to the liquor store that's open. You pay a little more. Or in the U.S., you go to the bootleggers and you pay a lot more. Because you still want to drink on Sunday, right? You get drunk every Sunday. You still want to have a drink, right? So demand is there. Demand is the same. Doesn't change. But supply has shifted from the low-cost supplier, which is, in the case of Saturday stores, it's gone to the high-cost supplier, which is the bootlegger. Here's the key. Who likes having this prohibition on alcohol on Sundays? The Baptists like it, but also the bootleggers like it. The bootleggers make money. The liquor stores around Vancouver do very good business on Sunday, right? They probably make more money on Sunday than they do on the other days, whatever, because there's no competition from BC Liquor, which sells at cheaper prices. So when you have this kind of I like it and I like it coalition, you can call it an unholy coalition because these guys are church people. When you have this kind of coalition supporting a government intervention, then it can continue for a long time. And here's the idea. All the Baptists are like, oh yeah, don't sell alcohol on Sunday. It's really terrible for people. And then the politicians are like, yeah, we don't want to sell alcohol on Sunday. And the bootleggers are like, yeah, don't sell alcohol on Sunday. And by the way, politician, my brother, have some money to make it okay, right? I'll give you a discount on liquor, is what the bootleggers would do. Politicians always have alcohol if they want it, right? So ethanol. Who are the Baptists with ethanol policy? Who are the Baptists? Furry hood girl looking down. Tap her. Her. Who are the Baptists? Sorry? I'm asking you, when it comes to U.S. ethanol, who are the Baptists supporting the U.S. ethanol program? No, the government is doing the program. But it's corn now. Who wants you to buy the corn? Who wants you to buy the ethanol? Who are the Baptists? Who are the good guys? Ethanol is going to save the planet. Who are those people? Environmentalists, the tree huggers, right? Save the planet, buy corn ethanol. Who are the bootleggers? Corn companies, distribution companies, right? All these companies that are making money off of selling corn. Now the Baptists, the environmentalists, have disavowed ethanol, a whole bunch of them. 90% of environmentalists say, I don't support ethanol anymore. But the program goes on, right? It's like a zombie. It will not die. And it's costing billions of dollars and hungry people and dead zones and all kinds of stuff. So this is an example of a government failure. And government failures happen, I'm not going to say they happen just as often as market failures, but they can happen and they can be very, very costly. Okay? That's an example of how regulation can work and not work. Okay, so then let's connect this whole thing about regulation with Ostrom and Coase. Ostrom, I'm just going to point out, those of you who walked in late, I'll get to Coase in a second. Those of you who walked in late, I said that Coase was a real pain in the ass to read, but we'll talk about it today, and we'll see how you interpreted Coase in terms of your homework, because I know there was a reason that you had to get into the Coase idea so you can do your homework. But Dietz, Ostrom, and Stern, give them all the authors their due, they write this very nice paper about governing the commons, and they talk about essentially the use of knowledge, which is distributed, which is borrowing from Hayek, right? And they talk about how communities can come up with different institutional ways of managing the commons, and they give, they talk about adaptive governance. More or less meaning you need the right governance for the right place at the right time. I just spent all day yesterday at a water conference over at UBC talking about governance, right? It has a lot to do with the community working together to manage water according to its needs, right? That's what governance is all about. It's a very, very loose idea. It's very difficult to nail down. This article, I'll recommend it to you as one of the better summaries that you can use forever, basically, especially if you're writing papers or if you're trying to think about how to structure a problem, because they say, okay, you need information to adapt. You need to deal with conflict. You have a mechanism of dealing with conflict. You need rules and also ways of changing rules. You need infrastructure. You have to be able to change. You need to be able to look at the results and deliberate and change the results. This is how you would run any organization from 6 people to 6 billion people, right? You need to be able to change and bring in information from all those people to improve matters. That's all I'm going to say about this paper. It's brilliant as a summary, and thank God it's short compared to Coase, right? So, but what is Ostrom talking about relative to this? If you're governing a commons, is there a market failure there? Is there a government failure there? Is there a market going on even? Or does the government have a role? The commons, so to speak, that she's talking about is saying, how are we going to manage our stuff? Right? There's not necessarily a government involved in the first place. the government really is, how does a town manage its water supply, for example, right? There is a politician, there is a mayor. If you have a town and they have their water supply here, this is my great drawing here, okay? You've got a bunch of people, and they're all more or less equal, and they need to manage the water. What Ostrom is talking about is all the people, like you're a town right now. One member per household comes in, and we're going to say, okay, how are we going to manage this limited water supply we have? Where are we going to put the toilets in the town, or the sewer lines? Or are we going to pay for a tank to store water in case that it doesn't rain? And then among all of us, we'll figure it out. There's not necessarily any government involved. We are the government. This is governance, right? It's just a group making a decision. But the reason it's not, for example, a market is because if this 70% of the room makes a decision, whatever they do, and you guys are like, nah, we didn't do that, they win, right? It's kind of like democracy. The majority will make the policy. They do want to bring everybody on board. It's not like the policy is to take all of your stuff. The policy is, we're going to do a water tower first, and then we're going to do a swimming pool later. You guys are all like, we want the swimming pool. These guys are like, we want the water tower, right? So we decide to do the water tower. You'll still benefit from it because it's a common pool good. It's just a prioritization question. So that's how you do the governance of something that you hold in common, right? That's how a village can do it. That's what she's talking about. You don't need a regulation. There is no market. So there's a third thing, basically, what's going on here, and it's called a non-market situation. It's a non-market situation where you can't use price signals, which I mentioned a while ago. Now, when it comes to Coase's discussion in this paper, which is called the problem of social cost, the social cost, remember, refers to it's the problem of a negative externality. I won't draw a graph. It's the problem of a negative externality where one person's behavior is going to have a negative impact on the other person, right? The doctor builds his office next to the confectioner, the candy maker. The candy maker has a loud machine going dong, 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 dong. The doctor is dumb enough to build his office next to that candy maker, but then he's an asshole enough to sue the candy maker and say, you can't run your candy machine there. The guy's been there for 80 years making candy. The doctor builds an office saying, now that's too much noise. You can't do that, right? That happens when people move into the countryside and they say, well, my house is here. You can't have a farm here anymore, right? That happens also. Oh, your farm is noisy and stinky, and it's been there for 100 years, but I just showed up, so you should go away. Not really a good way to meet your neighbors. So the problem of social cost is negative externalities, and what Coase talks about really is he talks about Pigou was out there, and this guy Pigou, who I've said, but this is how you spell his name. Pigou actually is an English guy. Peugeot is how you would say it, I suppose, in French. I'm bad at French. But Pigou said, oh, you just put a tax on. And Coase is like, are you sure you put a tax on? Is that really the best way to go? And in fact, he makes a point which I think is really interesting. I'll get to that in a second. So he says, Pigou says, oh, you put a tax. That's going to correct the market failure. That's going to internalize the externality. Not necessarily a bad idea, but Coase says, are you sure that's the only way to go? And as an example, let's say that you've got the doctor's office next to the candy maker. So the candy maker's here making a bunch of noise. The doctor can't see his patients. And the doctor says, I'm going to sue you. I don't care how he talks about it in the paper. Let's talk about it in the class. The candy maker is making a lot of noise. The doctor is trying to see patients. He's trying to hear someone's heart with his ear. He can't hear it because the machine's going dung, 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 dung. So now the question is, we can make a regulation here. We have a question of property rights and regulation. The property right is that the candy store was in business for 100 years. I was here first. That's a property right. I was making noise first. You should have known when you moved here I was making noise. The regulation, which I believe found in favor of the doctor, is that you're not allowed to create a nuisance, a noise, for your neighbor. So the doctor actually was given the right by the government to stop the candy maker from working. So the property right was moved by the law from the candy maker to the doctor. I think this is what happened in the paper, but don't worry if it's not true. This is still okay for an example. So now, what is the candy maker? What are the candy maker's choices? What can the candy maker do? What? Pay the doctor why? Damage. So like the doctor's saying, you're making noise, you have to pay me to compensate me. That's unfortunately the answer I'm going to get to in like 6 more questions, so hold that thought. What's the stupid version? What's the stupid answer of what the candy maker can do? The doctor says, you're making noise. I don't care. Shut down, right? So you can have a whole candy store that's been making children happy for 100 years shut down because of the evil doctor. But that's a government intervention. There's a regulation. The doctor has a property right, and that's that, right? That's the end of the game. But what Coase points out is, hey, wait a second. Maybe they can negotiate. Now, the fact is, that's interesting, maybe they can negotiate. So the candy maker can say, look, I will pay you money. You can put insulation on your wall. Or the candy maker can say, I'll make candy at night. You see your patients during the day. How's that for a deal? And I'll pay you $10 to like leave me alone, kind of thing. So that the candy maker can change his behavior to allow their interests not to clash, but to work together, right? I give you some money. I work at a different time. You get to see your patients. It's not inconvenient. And by the way, we're going to live next to each other for 40 years, so maybe we should be nice to each other, right? Neighborly relations are part of that. So the property rights shifted. Property rights shifted from the candy maker to the doctor. Did you guys pay your tuition? This is nuts. Wow. Okay. So the candy maker, it's not my fault, I didn't do it. So the candy maker, the property rights shift, and in a sense what that means is that if the property rights were with the candy maker, and the doctor says, I want you to be quiet, but the candy maker had the right to make noise, what's one solution to getting away from that situation? In the green shirt. I'm asking you. You right there. Yeah, you. Your shirt's green. If the candy maker has the right to make candy, what's one solution these two can live with each other? The doctor what? The doctor will connect? He'll what? I can't hear. The doctor will work at night. That's good. Okay, so the doctor says, okay, I won't bother you, Mr. Candy Maker, or I'll work at night. That's good. Good answer. What's another answer? Girl with a cup in the back, her, next to the hat guy. Hit her. You. What's another solution? What? No, the candy maker has the right to make noise. Huh? They could just make the noise, but how do they make a compromise with the doctor? One solution is a doctor can work at night. What's another solution? The doctor wants to work during the day, but the candy maker can make all the noise he wants. The doctor can pay the candy maker to make less noise or to move to the night, right? So one important point from this paper that is not necessarily as clear as you would like it to be is that it almost doesn't matter who has the right to make the noise. If the candy maker has the right, then the doctor can pay him to switch to the night. If the doctor has the right, the candy maker can switch to the night or pay the doctor to make the noise. Either way, they can make a deal. Okay? There is no regulation here, necessarily, because the law has decided that the property right is here or there. That's the important point of this. You don't necessarily need to have a regulation for two parties to a nuisance, to a negative externality, to make a deal. Now, very important question. Two parties is not 2,000 parties. Two parties is not someone driving by in a car and some kid next to the road, right? So it has to be easy for those two parties to negotiate. what is called in economics low transaction costs. Transaction costs, the idea of a transaction cost, which I think I have mentioned before. Have I mentioned this before? Not exactly? Okay. Transaction costs are the costs of going, literally going out of your house, finding someone you want to do business with, negotiating a deal, completing the deal, enforcing the deal, and so on. Right? They're all the costs of doing, making a negotiation, making a transaction. Literally, it's one of the more useful phrases from economics because it's literally true. Transaction costs. Okay? If you're in England, it's transactions costs or transactions cost, but it doesn't matter. So when you go on iTunes and you buy a song, has anybody bought a song on iTunes? 12 people. Anybody gone to BitTorrent and downloaded a movie? Yeah. All right. So I'll tell you. So here's actually a good example. You want to get a movie. Okay, I want to go see whatever it is, Dawn of the Dead or something like that. I don't have Dawn of the Dead. I'm at home. Where's my movie, right? So you can do a couple things. You can order it on Netflix, wait for a week. You can go down to the rental place if they're still in business, try and find it. Someone might have checked it out. You can go online sometimes and you can try and buy it. They're like, give me your credit card number and where's your zip code and do you want to participate in a customer satisfaction survey? It's like, give me my stupid movie. Or you can just download it. It's like, give me that movie. And it comes down in like 20 minutes, right? Torrents are the best. I'm just like totally a thief. So, but why? One of the reasons why torrents are so handy is like when you rent a DVD and they put in and you put it in you got your popcorn, you got your beer, you're ready to watch the movie, and they're showing you coming attractions, advertisements, right? Come watch another movie. You're like 10 minutes trying to get your movie. You try and forward it, locked. You can't forward the movie. Fuck you, right? So you're gonna download it because it just skips all those commercials. It goes right to the movie. Customer satisfaction. So Apple, the reason I said Apple or Netflix actually is Netflix is doing streaming right now because they want to lower the transaction costs. They want to say, don't wait a week to get the movie in the mail. Don't go to the store. It'll come to it'll come right to your computer or right to your phone or whatever. So they're streaming the movies, and people say, you know what? For $1.99 or whatever it is, I will stream this movie because it makes me feel good because now it's legal because I'm paying for it. And maybe it's better quality, more convenient, or it doesn't have like someone moving in the audience in front of the movie or whatever. So people are willing to pay for the movies if the transaction costs are low. When you go out to a restaurant, you don't go to whatever it is, Victoria Island to go to dinner, or Vancouver Island. You don't go to Victoria to go to dinner. It takes 3 hours. You're like, I'm going to go to somewhere close to home maybe. In fact, I'll go to my refrigerator, very close to home. That's a transaction cost situation. And I'm too tired to make dinner. How about I make some toast? I open a can, I make some soup or whatever, right? So all of those things relate to how much effort it takes us to get what we really want. It's not that you tell someone, oh, I watched a movie, and they say, oh, but were the transaction costs high? Well, it could be high. You could have this legendary story about what a pain it was to watch the movie. I got to get a parking place. I had $18 for tickets. I couldn't get a seat. Someone was munching popcorn in front of me. There's all kinds of stories, but literally the stuff that happens besides consuming the movie is the transaction cost. So what Coase is getting at here is that if you have a low transaction cost environment, the doctor lives next to the candy man, he could say, hey, yo, let's talk. They go right next door. That makes it easy to negotiate this stuff. When you have air pollution from cars that are driving by, it might make a lot more sense to have a government regulation because the transaction costs of finding all the victims and finding all the drivers are so high. Right? That's the whole point. That's why we use this expression. And one thing he says that is significant, and I've pointed this out, is that when you have, so say that you have two situations. Let's change this a little bit. You've got two situations. One is you've got a factory, and the other one, and the factory is next to houses, and there's little children outside or whatever. So you can do a few things. One is that you can regulate the factory, so the factory is putting out pollution, and that's a bad thing. So you can regulate the factory saying you can't put out pollution. That's one idea. And the factory will do it at a certain cost. The other one is you can have a tax on pollution, which will usually, which can be set to accomplish the same goal, right? The regulation of the tax can accomplish the same goal. But the other one, as a Coasean type of solution, would be that the factory, say these guys have the right to clean air, they have the property right, these guys can say, you're polluting us, and we want you to stop unless you do what? Pay the money. Give me some money. I'll let you pollute. If you're polluting, it's okay with me. People do this all the time, right? If you want to find a cheap place to live, you live next to the railroad, right? You live next to the freeway. People always are living next to those places because the house is cheap, the rent is cheap. And some people don't care. They're like, I don't have, either I'm poor or I'd rather spend the money on my big TV system. So we've got regulation, we've got tax, and we've got a side payment, a compensation. The key difference between the tax and the side payment is what? The factory is paying in both circumstances. What's the big difference? It's illegal? No. Sorry? Different recipient, right? In fact, if the government pays taxes and it goes off to whatever, the capital, these guys are still sitting here and the pollution has fallen because the price mechanism works. But they don't have that money. They would like to see that money, in fact, right? But the money is going off to some distant capital to be used on whatever, right? But what Coase is pointing out is like, isn't it better that money just goes to these guys? Because the pollution is falling no matter what. But the money is going to the government instead of going to the people who are harmed. So in that sense, he's like, that is a lot more fair in terms of negative externalities, because the whole point of a negative externality is that there is a cost of behavior that is falling on an innocent party. If your pollution is hurting him, and I take the money to tax you, well, you're just like, thanks for nothing, right? A little bit less pollution. Thank you for not polluting. So that's what he makes a point of in this thing, in this paper. Not only that you can have the flexibility of making a deal one way or the other, but that the money actually, he says it almost just like, oh, by the way, right? Which is kind of funny, but it's actually huge, right? The fact that those people get the money. Okay, we're almost out of time. Wow. All we go through regulations. Okay. And the regulation, by the way, on the factory, don't put on your jacket yet. Hold on a second. Oh, cold. That's different. Hug your neighbor. Okay. This is conserving energy here. The regulation can also be set, just like the tax. Here's an interesting thing. These guys next door, there's three problems that can happen. You set the tax at the wrong level, too high, too low. Right? You set the regulation at the wrong level, too high, too low. Or the people here, this is a little bit trickier. The people here can get the wrong compensation. It's not so obvious that that's too high, too low, because you're dealing with a market transaction, which is like, hey, we'll let you pollute if you compensate us, because they have the property rights. But sometimes it might be the people next door might ask for enough money to make them happy, which might be less than these guys are willing to pay. They might have more money available, but they don't pay it. That's not necessarily bad. When you go buy a cup of coffee and they say $2, you're saying, oh, that's worth $3 to me. They say, oh yeah, give us $3. No, they don't do that, right? That's customer surplus. So there could be some surplus here from the factory, or from these guys might say, give us $100 and really it's worth $50 to us, right? Our kids' cancer, $50. But if you give $100, we got cancer and video games, right? And maybe these guys are willing to pay $200. It doesn't really matter some ways, but discovering the right price is a little bit complicated here. Discovering the right price from the government perspective in terms of taxes or regulation is actually harder, because the government might make They might set one regulation that's supposed to work everywhere, and it's not customized for the local conditions, which is what Ostrom would tell you. Local conditions matter. Okay.